Hey there, music lovers. Welcome to the channel. Thanks so much for stopping by, and thanks for all that you do, taking time out of your day to watch these videos. And it's been great chatting with a lot of you too. Um, what brings me to this video about hair bands and all that mess, I was looking at some footage of the band Rat, who just went on the road. They've got this new formed lineup with original lead singer Stephen Pearcy, along with the bass player Juan something. I can't remember his last name. What, it doesn't really matter, to be honest with you. Rat, I was just looking at footage of Rat, and it just brought me back to the early days of the 80's when I was listening to them and Out of the Cellar, that album that had like Round and Round and Wanted Man. And it kind of got me thinking about the whole hair metal scene and why that went away. And then it kind of led me into the 90's and how I think a lot of the things that happened in the 80's also happened in the 90's. It just maybe doesn't seem to be as laughable because we were dealing with two different types of genres of music. But I think there were a lot of similarities between the 80's and the 90's, and some different styles of music that came in that became very popular and then just kind of got old pretty quickly. And I wanted to kind of backtrack to my earliest memories of hair metal. I tried thinking, how did all this shit get started? Because I remember when I was in college, when I got there, I felt like I was from the future or something. I showed up, I had a crate of CDs. Everybody else was listening to vinyl. I even had a class because I was like majoring in radio and television, and I had a speech class, and I had to pick a topic. I remember one week I had to give a speech, and I picked how CDs were gonna, replace vinyl. And I remember people looking at me like, "What is this guy talking about?" But I mean, it wasn't long before that happened, and I was listening to Metallica. People thought I was crazy. Like, what are you listening to that stuff for? Everybody else was listening to, whatever the hair metal was at that time. And, like Cinderella and that kind of stuff. And, a few years later, Metallica ruled the world, and they were like one of the biggest bands. I was listening to Iron Maiden. People thought I was crazy. Iron Maiden is like one of the biggest bands in the world now, many, many years later. Whereas a lot of those bands kind of went away. And I was just thinking, how did all this hair stuff get started? Like, where did this all come from? And I tried to dial it back to my earliest memories of metal in pop music, not metal in general. I really don't think of some of these bands like they're called hair metal bands, but to me, they're just like these pop rock, maybe hard rock pop. I don't know what you want to call it, pop metal. I don't even like to use the word metal because I don't really associate that with some of these bands. I think it does a disservice to the real metal bands like the Metallicas and the Maidens and the Slayers and Judas Priest and bands who really were dishing out the metal. I remember when Quiet Riot came out. That was like the first time that I recall hearing something like hard rock on the top 40. Up until that time, top 40 was just, it was more or less just real poppy, pop rock, Hall & Oates and Lionel Richie and Men at Work. And, you had some other bands that were hitting the top 40. But for the most part, it was a lot of just lighter fare. Country music had even crossed over into top 40 with like, Alabama and Dolly Parton and a lot of shit like that. But there came a point in the early 80's, like when ZZ Top was coming out with their Eliminator album, and then you had Quiet Riot was all of a sudden hearing like Come On Feel the Noise, which Quiet Riot was actually the first metal band to have a number one album, and they also had a top five hit with Come On Feel the Noise. So Quiet Riot was a major breakthrough. And of course, you also had like your Twisted Sisters, who I never considered them metal. I always hated them. We're Not Gonna Take It, I guess, was a fun song. But, the Scorpions were kind of creeping. And we started getting some of these heavier type songs in the top 40, which I had never seen before. And, then you had like Rat in 1984 with Out of the Cellar. And of course, they had like Round and Round and Wanted Man. They were on MTV. And I remember buying their album Out of the Cellar. and thinking that, those songs were pretty cool. Warren DeMartini, the guitar player, was impressive. I thought he had some really cool licks. I even liked Rat's first album. It was like an EP, the self-titled album. Had a few songs on it, but they were pretty, pretty rockin'. And they didn't seem like they had sold out or anything. That would come later. I think they put this album out called Dance, which, every album that came out after Out of the Cellar, I thought, just got worse and worse, and to the point where you get to like Dance, Dance or something. It's just awful. They had totally gotten sucked up into the whole hair metal scene. And then you get like Bon Jovi was coming out, like with Runaway, that was in '84, and it wasn't long before they were, hitting it with the New Jersey album. Motley Crue was another milestone that I can recall. They had the Theater of Pain album in 1985, which had Home Sweet Home on it, which was shocking to me when I first heard it because it had a piano in it. I mean, I was used to Motley Crue just like rocking out and, Shout at the Devil, Live Wire, Too Young to Fall in Love, and then they come out with Theater of Pain, and they got this, Home Sweet Home, which I thought was a cool song, but it had a piano intro. It was like the first power ballad. This was the song that really got that whole genre going, because before you know it, in 1986, you had Poison, Cinderella, and these bands all had like their they had like their harder hits, and then the second single was like a ballad, and it just kept on going. 1987, you had like White Lion, Whitesnake was coming around. Of course, Whitesnake is a band that they were around way before the whole hair metal thing, but they got caught up in it. Then you had your Winger, like we get to 88, and that's when you really start getting some, Winger and Kicks, and Brittany Fox, and 89 brought in like the Skid Row and Warrant. Enough's Enough was another one. Great title for that band, really good name. Enough's Enough. And then by the time we get to like 1990, you've got like Firehouse, that kind of shit. And when I started hearing that stuff, I was like, this has got to end soon, please. I think that the hair metal scene kind of ran its course. There's a lot of popular belief that a band like Nirvana came and they crushed the hair metal scene. And I don't think it's quite that simple. I don't think there was any one real event that crushed the hair metal scene. I think that the hair metal scene was kind of dying. It was a slow death, but it was on its way out. And I hate to compare it to this, but it's kind of like if you've got an animal or a pet and you take it to the vet because it's sick and you got to put it down, the vet may have pulled the trigger, but, it was on its way out. The animal was on its way out. And I think that's what kind of happened with the whole hair metal thing, is that these bands, people were getting sick and tired of seeing all these dudes dressed like women. And, it's like, I could never really identify with what was going on there. It's like, what was so masculine and cool about dressing up like a woman and putting on makeup and all this teased hair? It's like, you look like a freak. It's like, I never could understand that. And so I think that the whole hair metal thing was primed to kind of get a shot in the head. And I think that came in 1990 when the grunge sound started coming in. I remember seeing this interview with Janie Lane of Warrant, where he talked about how he went into the record label, he went into the office, and instead of seeing a Warrant poster up on the wall, it was Alice in Chains. Alice in Chains was 1990 when they came out with that album, Facelift, I think it was, that had like Man in the Box. I remember seeing that video when it first came out on MTV, and I was thinking to myself, wow, this is some heavy stuff here. This is like, what is this? It was just so much different than what we had been listening to with all the Firehouse and all that shit from the 80s. It seemed like things were getting darker and getting more serious. And I think this was the change that a lot of people were kind of looking for. And then not long after that, we had the Nirvana album, Nevermind, from 1991, which that blew up. And, Pearl Jam, not long after that, 1991. We started seeing a change in these songs that were coming out. The 80s this stuff, it was very much, you know, guys were singing about getting chicks. And they were, you know, singing a lot of them in these really high voices, really high registers. In the 90s, it was a whole different story. You know, a lot of the singers were kind of singing like this, and they had real deep voices, and you know, like Eddie Vedder and you know, STP. Now Chris Cornell from Soundgarden, a little bit different. He could sing high, but it was a different kind of high. You know, Alice in Chains, very, you know, gritty, deeper vocal, you know, singing about, you know, more disturbing things, you know, looking at the world from a glass half empty point of view. You know, Pearl Jam singing about Jeremy and, you know, this troubled childhood. And it was just darker. Things took on a darker tone from the 80s, which was a lot more happier. And then, of course, something else that kind of struck me is kind of like in the 80s, you know, in the 80s, it started off with the innovators, I guess you can say, you know, the guys who kind of set the trend, like the Quiet Riots and the Rats and the Motley Crue. And then by the time we started getting later into the 80s, we got a lot of the copycats, you know, like the Tricksters and the Britney Foxes and all these shit bands. And it just became like cookie cutter. And that's, I think, when eventually that kind of collapsed, because there was just no substance there. And I think the same thing happened when we got into the 90s. You know, after we got our Nirvana and our Pearl Jam and our Soundgarden and the Stone Temple Pilots, eventually in the mid 90s, like with, you know, like in 1994, we got bands like Bush. You know, I couldn't stand Bush when they came out with like Glycerine, and, you know, I couldn't stand Gavin Rossdale, another one, I couldn't stand his voice. Candlebox, 1993, Silverchair. I remember this stuff to me just sounded just like generic crap. And it was down, you know, like where were the guitar solos? It seemed like everything was down to a couple of chords. Everything was just kind of angry and boring. You know, we didn't hear anything more about, you know, great bass players, no more guitar solos. There were no great singers. Everything sounded like these guys sounded like they were taking a shit. I mean, it was just awful. And then when you get to the 2000s, right around, you know, 99 and 2000, we started getting bands like Three Doors Down and, you know, 3 Days Grace and Creed. I remember when Creed came out, I was just like, holy shit, I can't believe this. I mean, that guy, Scott Stapp, I think it was just like awful. I could not take any of that shit. And I don't think that rock really recovered. You know, there was nothing new that came in. You know, you can say what you want about the Nirvana thing and the Pearl Jam thing. At least it was different. But nothing came out after that that I can think of. If you can think of it, put it down below and let me know. But it just seems like once the whole grunge thing, once the imitators came in, we never really got to a place where it was reset and we got a fresh new batch of bands that kind of set a new trend. It seems like for the past 20 years or so, we've just been lost and there really hasn't been anything great. I mean, there have been some interesting bands that have kind of popped up, but I'm talking about like a new genre, you know. And so what I'm basically getting at here is it seems like in the 80s and in the 90s, we started off with the innovators and then we got the copycats and then it eventually collapsed. And I want to know what you think. I want to know if you agree with this. You know, what do you think killed the hair bands? What do you think about the whole grunge thing in the 90s? You know, what were some of your favorite bands from both of those eras? What are some of the bands that you thought were the innovators and some of the bands that were the copycats? You know, put it down below. Be sure to give this video a thumbs up if you like it, and be sure to hit subscribe too. And I will check you later with another video.